So kind of the background of why I got interested in this, I look at human-wildlife conflict, and especially in Southern Africa. And as the human population is increasing throughout the world, there's more and more people are moving to areas that used to be predominantly for wildlife. And as that continues to happen, you see more and more conflict between humans and wildlife because they're sharing the environment more often. And this especially leads to an increased potential for retaliatory killings. In Africa, this is really common with livestock herders. If they lose a cow to a lion, then in return, they will kill that lion or another lion or just any lion that they see. And I guess let me step back and make sure everybody understands what human-wildlife conflict is. It's basically any negative interactions that happen when humans and wildlife interact together. So that could be loss of livestock, loss of crops are really common in Africa, but even the spread of disease through zoonotic diseases that are transferred to humans from wildlife. Basically all kinds of different negative behaviors that happen when humans and wildlife come together. So there's also potential for habitat degradation, which can happen either on purpose because humans have animosity towards the wildlife that they're sharing an environment with, or it could just happen on accident because the humans are using the land for a different purpose, and that degrades the land in terms of what the wildlife is it for. So we've already seen a lot of increases in these human-wildlife conflicts throughout the globe, and it's predicted that this is only going to get worse as more and more people move into these areas. And this is especially problematic throughout sub-Saharan Africa because the population is increasing very rapidly. So you just see more and more people, and they're spreading across more and more of what used to be considered wild habitat. And this is even more important because despite the many protected areas that we have, they're not enough to sustain a lot of the large mammals in the world. And in Africa, the large mammals you would be talking about, elephants, lions, rhinos, none of these animals could survive in sustainable populations within most of the protected areas. So in order to conserve them, we have to consider areas outside of the national parks. And those areas outside of the national parks are also where people live. So basically my work is somewhere in the realm of this issue between people and animals and conservation and development. So from this perspective, I wanted to look at what people think about wildlife, because if you think that wildlife is great, you're probably more likely to engage in behaviors that would support the wildlife. And if you have some animosity towards wildlife, you're more likely to engage in some potentially harmful behaviors. And I see this even within Gainesville. I know a lot of people who are farmers in this area, and some of them have a very negative relationship with coyotes, and they want to shoot any coyote they see, even if they've never lost an animal to coyotes. Others have a more, I don't know, understand that it's just part of the ecosystem. They do what they can to protect their animals, and they don't actually have like a negative relationship with the coyotes. So you see the same thing in Africa. Behavior or attitudes are very diverse, and people can develop their attitudes for a number of different reasons. So it's kind of a complicated issue, but it is important because it influences your behavior. So in this case, knowing what influences your attitudes can help us redirect our conservation focus to make sure that we are addressing what's influencing people's attitudes, which is then in turn influencing their behaviors. So a lot of people have tried to figure out what exactly influences attitudes, and the short answer is that it's complicated. And we know that direct and indirect costs can have a big can be very important. Direct costs, particularly in the context of Africa, would be losing a cow to a lion, or a hippo came and ate all of your maize out of your field. And indirect costs can be, in some cases, I've seen kids that weren't able to go to school because there were wild buffaloes running around in the area and it wasn't safe for them to walk by them. Or parents didn't sleep because they were up all night chasing monkeys out of their fields. So those are kind of indirect, hard to quantify, but they do have an impact. And then direct and indirect benefits. Some people benefit from tourism, they can have jobs, they can get actual cash from wildlife, especially within Southern Africa. And then some of the indirect benefits are they can have their watershed is more protected because the national park is nearby and it's keeping the forest, or just the idea that wildlife brings in tourists and then maybe those tourists donate money to build a school for the community. All of those things can be indirect benefits. And people's past experiences can have a huge impact. If you personally have had a negative experience with wildlife, you're more likely, we think, to have a negative attitude towards wildlife. And it can also be the past experiences of someone you know. Maybe you grew up hearing from your grandfather telling about horror stories of some type of wildlife. And then psychological aspects. Some people just have a fear of animals and of certain types of animals. I will admit I am terrified of lizards. I know it's irrational, it doesn't make any sense, but I always have been. So you do have to kind of consider that fact that some people just have fears that can influence their behaviors. And finally, demographics. So we know that demographics are really important, and a lot of people have published articles on how they're important. And when you compare all the articles, they're important in different ways in different places. So we know that geography is really important as far as which factors affect people's attitudes towards wildlife. So that's what I'm going to look for geography. We'll start with the map. This is the Greater Limpopo Trans-Frontier Conservation Area in Southern Africa. So it was a national agreement that started in 2002 between South Africa, Zimbabwe, and Mozambique. And the dark green are all national parks that are protected in each country. And then the light green was this idea that the national parks are not all connected and there's not enough land for these large mammals. So let's consider these outside lands. And we know people are living there, but let's try to find like a buffer zone type area where we support conservation, but we also allow human activity. So within this study area, I'm actually looking at this part in this study. And I wanted to see exactly which factors are influencing people's attitudes towards wildlife. So based off of the literature that I found, I thought that all of these might be important factors. So looking especially at demographics, gender, age, were they educated or not educated? And most of these are just yes, no, binary variables, aside from age, which is discrete, and then distance from park was measured in kilometers. But whether or not they were employed, if they owned livestock, if their access to natural resources had been restricted by the park, if they received any benefits from the wildlife, and if they had any direct costs, which were livestock loss, if they lost any livestock being goats or cows in the last year, and crop damage, we looked at if they had lost more than half of their crop in the last year. And then human harm, if anyone in their immediate family had been harmed by an animal, and that is at any time in their lifetime. Yes. So this is formal employment, if you're receiving a paycheck from someone. And in this area, that would probably be people who go across to South Africa and they work in the mines for short periods of time and come back. or they're working for the game park. There are a few teachers and a few nurses, but there's not a lot of formal employment. So the reason that's on there is because I wanted to look at wealth, and with the data that I had, I couldn't really find a good way to assess wealth. So I tried to put that in there as a proxy, knowing that if they had a formal job, they had cash income coming in. And I wouldn't say it's the best variable. I would like to have a better wealth indicator. But that's what I went with in this study. So based off of previous studies and just common sense, I thought that people who received benefits would be more likely to have positive attitudes, and that if they were employed, they would be wealthier and therefore more likely to have positive attitudes, particularly as probably half of the employment opportunities in the area are linked to the park. I thought if they had their access restricted to natural resources, that would create a negative attitude towards wildlife and towards the park. And of course, if they had any cost, loss of livestock, or loss of crops. I thought if they lived closer to the park, they would have more negative attitudes because they would be more likely to come into contact with wildlife. The younger versus older kind of comes from this attitude that younger people might be more educated, especially in Mozambique, because they've had a civil war recently and the adults have little to no formal education. But a lot of the children now are in school, or younger adults have been able to go to school at least for a few years. And so we thought the younger and the educated might possibly be linked to each other. And finally, that men would have more positive attitudes. And this comes from the idea that women are more likely to use the natural resources. They're the ones who are going out to collect firewood. They're going to the river to get water. They're bathing their children in the river. So they have more opportunities for the human-wildlife conflict. And in Mozambique especially, they're also the primary farmers in the family. So they would have more of an impact if their fields were destroyed. So with all of those different indicators, I threw them all into a logistic regression just to kind of see what happened. And some of them were important, some of them weren't. So then I kind of played around with it for a little bit, trying to develop the best model. So which model best predicted whether or not people would have positive or negative attitudes towards wildlife. And the most significant ones were the ones that had the best fit for a model. So these 5 variables can account for 71.4% of the variation that we see in people's attitude. So given that it was a lot of different variables to look at, that's a pretty good result. And all of these were significant at p less than 0.01. But how they were significant was a little surprising, especially to me. So gender had a, not really positive or negative. It was as expected that females were more likely to have a negative attitude than males. And restricted access was the one that especially surprised me. So if people had their access restricted, they were more likely to have positive attitudes towards wildlife. If they agreed with the rules and regulations that govern the wildlife, they were more likely to have positive attitudes. If they received any benefits, they were more likely to have positive attitudes. And the farther away from the park that they lived, the more likely they were to have positive attitudes. So this kind of brings a lot of conclusions and directions for the conservation efforts in Mozambique. First of all, the costs were not a significant predictor, which was really surprising to me and to a lot of the people that I work with, because we had been operating under the assumption that if people are losing livestock, that's leading to this negative attitude and they're more likely to engage in retaliatory killings or poisonings of lions or leopards. And that's not really the case, which kind of surprised all of us and has a lot of implications for the projects that we're trying to implement in this area. But I'll get to some of those implications next. Also, men were 1.71 times more likely to have positive attitudes, which goes along with the hypothesis. And restricted access, again, that was the one that really surprised me because it was counterintuitive, but also it was the most significant. So it had the lowest p-value and the highest walled value. So not only was it important, it was really important, and it was really important in a way that we did not predict. So I'll step back a little bit. This is another map, and this shows all of the households that were surveyed for this study. And I will clarify that I personally did not do surveys, but I know the people who did. And knowing that distance is important, you can see that some of these households are very, very close to the park. And especially that cluster up there, there are a lot of households right there that are very close to the park. And those households are of concern because they're very close to the park. They have fairly negative attitudes. And the idea from this information could be that maybe that's not a great place for people to live. Unfortunately, the reason that a lot of people are living there is because they used to live in the park, and when it was made into a park, they moved out. And having already moved recently, it's unlikely that any of them might move again. But it might be important for the relationship between humans and wildlife that they not live so close to the park. Which also might help in future planning when you go to the park and you encourage people to move outside, maybe they should go a little bit farther. But also looking at wildlife benefits were important. And this surprised me because when we asked people, did they receive any benefits from the wildlife? Basically, the benefits that we're talking about could be cash benefits because the communities receive 20% of the trophy hunting fees, and a lot of the communities just divide that cash and each person takes them home with them, which sounds encouraging. But if you do the math, we're talking like a couple dollars a year that these people are getting from wildlife. And the other benefit that they could potentially get is meat. So when a hunter comes in and kills an elephant or a hippo or whatever animal, usually they just want the trophy and not the meat. So the park coordinates to bring the meat to the different communities and divide it up to each of the individuals who live there. Which again, people are taking home maybe 1 kilogram of meat or 2 pounds of meat for the entire year. That's their benefit. Yet, with these small benefits, a couple dollars or a couple pounds of meat, they were a lot more likely to have positive attitudes towards wildlife, which is really encouraging to me because I see a lot of room for improvement. I don't think it would be logistically difficult for us to make sure that more people were getting some of this benefit, even if it is just a small benefit. So if you look at this, there are very few people who ever received benefits. Oh, I made a mistake, sorry. I was putting this together very quickly today. But this is actually the yes column, and this is the no column. So that makes a difference. Yeah, so there are not a lot of people who ever received any benefits. So if we were able to make sure that more people are receiving even these simple and small benefits, then it could have a huge impact for attitudes towards wildlife. Yes?
Compensation, like from damage, do I get compensation?
No. There's no compensation for damage to crop or wildlife. What does happen is if there's a problem animal that's been found killing a lot of livestock or spending a lot of time in multiple people's fields, the park will come in and either relocate it or kill the animal if it's been an issue as far as human safety. So the park kind of tries to help a little bit, but there's no financial income. And of course, once your field is destroyed, it's destroyed. And any efforts to come in and relocate the animal are just kind of for prevention in the future. Yeah. Yes, yes, mostly.
So most of the people
Yeah, and I'll talk about that restricted access right now, actually, because that was really surprising. So I thought that if people were denied their access that they previously had to these natural resources, that would create some animosity towards the park and towards wildlife and conservation in general. But what we found is that the restricted access is basically these people were moved out of the park, and the park put up a fence. So now people are not allowed to come into the park because of the fence. And at first, it was a little bit of an issue because that was a major source of water for people, especially for their cattle. So that kind of led to this thinking that, well, now that people have this barrier that's preventing them from going and getting the water that they used to, they're gonna, why do the wildlife get this water and we don't get this water? And that kind of develops this negative attitude. But as it turns out, the fence also does other things. And basically the fence keeps the wildlife on their side and away from the people. So because the fence has really decreased the incidences of human-wildlife conflict, that's kind of what turned the fence into a good thing. So even though it does restrict their access to some of the resources, it's seen as a more positive thing, which again is surprising. So the fence is a good thing. And these are kind of my main takeaway points for you, but also giving back to the organizations that work in this area. I mentioned before that there was this idea that we should focus on making sure that people weren't losing their crops or their livestock, and that would make everything better. And according to these attitudes, they're not really influenced by that loss. And I would like to do some interviews and focus groups to follow up on that and kind of see why that is. But it could be that people are just used to it. They've lived in this area for a long time, even before the park was there. They might just accept that you're going to lose some livestock every now and then. You're going to lose some crops every now and then. And as long as it's below a certain threshold, maybe that's acceptable. And I say that with some hesitation, because I do think that the efforts to minimize that could be very important in terms of food security and livelihood. So I don't want to discount them completely. But as far as people's attitudes towards wildlife and the conservation goals, it doesn't seem to have such an impact. However, as I mentioned with the benefits, there's huge potential to increase those benefits and to see that really make a difference in people's attitudes and hopefully also in their behavior. And encouraging people to move farther away, I think might be a good thing, but it might be too soon for that because they had already been moved, and there's potential for that to have more negative aspects that, oh, the park is making us move again, and then it turns conservation people into the bad guy. And so that, I think, should be considered with caution, and definitely more research should be done, talking to people, seeing what they think. But it's also relevant because Mozambique is trying to build new schools and communities, and the idea is that they're going to build them in central locations and encourage people to move there in order to get access to these resources. So with that in mind, and with this information, it might be useful to encourage the government to put those farther away from the park, and then see if people want it. And then, of course, the fence is a good thing, which is good to know because in some places people do not like the fences because it keeps them out of what they consider their land. But it also does protect them from wildlife. And this is only one of the many conservation areas that you saw on the first map. So this is good also for other people in the area to know that the fence might be a positive thing. And it's a good option to consider in the nearby conservation areas. So these are my main takeaways. And I apologize if I went too fast or too confusing on anything. But now you can go ahead and ask me any questions that you might have right there.